Well, hi everyone, and it's lovely to see some of you here in person, and we've got a few people here with us on Zoom as well. So welcome everyone. Jomriep Sua, Xin chào các bạn. I am Sango Mahanty, and I'm your host, and also the author of the book that we're discussing today, Unsettled Frontiers, Market Formation in the Cambodia-Vietnam Borderlands. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose unceded lands we're hosting this event from today. And I'm joined by four eminently qualified colleagues. Each of these scholars has worked for many, many years in the spaces that are addressed by my book, which is what we're here to talk about. They've worked in Cambodia, Vietnam, border regions, frontier regions, and also on several of the themes that are covered in the book. And thanks to the marvels of Zoom, we have Sarah Turner joining us from McGill University in Montreal. And we have John-Christophe Diepart and Chanrith Ngin coming to us from Cambodia. And my Crawford colleague, Sarah Milne, is with us here in person in Canberra. And Kat Taylor is helping us out on Zoom from Western Australia, as is the way with such events these days. And my deepest thanks and gratitude to all of you for being part of this panel today. It was a very big thing to ask. So I'm going to start our session with a short introduction to the book, and then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute reflection from each of the panelists, followed by a broader discussion. So I will kick off then with a short passage from the book. I met Surya in 2013 in the village of Phum Prambe in Cambodia's Mondulkiri province, near the border with Vietnam. Age 55, Surya grew up in Vietnam's Mekong Delta and identified as part of the Khmer ethnic minority known as Khmer Rouge. He moved to Cambodia as a young man in the post-conflict period of the 1990s, where he first lived in the border province of Takao, south of the capital Phnom Penh. In 1997, Surya migrated upland to Phum Prambe, which was then a small indigenous Bunong village. I'll just change the slide there, which is a more recent picture of Phum Prambe. So at that time, it was a small indigenous Phnom village and Cambodian military outpost. He followed his cousin who had moved there earlier and was running a small coffee store. For his first few years, Surya survived by fetching water for the military and by collecting and selling various forest products to Vietnamese buyers. In the year 2000, when the area was beset with rice shortages, a Bunong family accepted his offer to give them rice in exchange for enough land to build a house and establish a small farm. As more of his family members moved to Phum Prambe, Surya started to think of it as his homeland. Migration surged in 2005 when well-connected provincial elites started to grab and clear land around the village that they would resell to new settlers for between $300 and $400 per hectare. Surya revealed that the powerful ones would take as many as 100 to 500 hectares each. New roads rapidly dissected the land and destroyed the Bunong community's sacred burial forest. Even as a relatively new settler, Surya keenly felt this cosmological and material disturbance, recounting, "After the burial forest was burned and the stumps were dug out, I dreamed about ghosts from the forest with dark bodies who said they had nowhere to live." Oops. Surya's story captures the turbulence and transformations that are shaping this border region. I met him when I was working on a project about forest carbon schemes in Mondulkiri province between 2012 and 2014, along with Sarah Milne, who was also working on that project. And while we were busy studying the politics of a specific REDD+ or forest carbon scheme, we witnessed how the surrounding landscape and communities were being completely transformed by industrial rubber plantations and a smallholder boom in cassava, among other things. I wanted to know why these booms were occurring and their effects, which became the focus of my future fellowship project between 2014 and 2018. The book draws on hundreds of conversations and several weeks of leafing through musty archival records in France and Vietnam. There were also too many hairy motorcycle rides and kilos of red soil on and in my body to keep count. It also rests on the support of a very large village of family, friends, and colleagues. Unsettled Frontiers gives you a window. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. Must have been talking about all the people that helped me. Unsettled Frontiers gives you a window into the changes that are sweeping through this important and fascinating borderland. I think it's especially important to try and understand, and so I try to convey, the stories and challenges of those living through and driving these changes. I also engaged the bigger question of how spaces at the edges of global markets are being progressively incorporated into those markets. In geography, we call these spaces frontiers. And globally, frontiers are spaces of extreme environmental and social disruption that need to be better understood and the risks addressed. Frontiers are an intense case of market formation. So although I talk about frontier markets, we can ask whether the book's insights on how markets operate, how they tick, can have broader resonance with markets more broadly. The book argues that frontier markets are always in formation. New commodity networks take hold, they change over time, and they can also demobilize or fall apart. But larger processes of land commodification, labour mobilisation and migration, as shown in this picture, ensure that markets continue to evolve in new ways with differentiated risks and opportunities. I liken frontier markets to Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome, which is their term for tangled and unbounded social phenomena that don't have clear organisational hierarchies or beginnings and ends. Looking at markets in this way can take us beyond a common preoccupation with specific value chains and commodities to see how different commodity networks interact and how these connections in turn put markets in a continual state of flux. As rhizomes, markets are volatile, unpredictable, and for many small farmers, quite risky. In this part of the world, states have played a really crucial role in catalysing markets, but having done so, they're often challenged to govern them. And when things go wrong, what I call market misfires after Michel Pallon's work, state legitimacy can come into question. I look at this in the book through the case of biofuel in Vietnam and rubber in French Indochina. But we could also consider whether this resonates anywhere else. I was struck, for instance, by how things worked out for the government in Australia when they let the market handle the distribution of rapid antigen tests quite recently. And it involved a blowtorch being turned back onto the government for people who are joining us from elsewhere. So I'm aiming to really catalyse broader conversations about frontiers, markets, and their governance. There is a lot more to say about the contents of the book, but I'm going to stop there so that I leave space for our wonderful panelists to share their reflections. So I'm going to call now on Sarah Turner. Sarah, you might like to unmute yourself, and I might go and sit over with Sarah over there.
All right, shall I get going?
Yeah, go for it.
All righty. Okay, well, first, a big thank you to Sango for inviting me to be part of this event. It's really great that we can get together in these COVID times in this way, and that Zoom actually is behaving so far. I think for the best way for me to start my brief contribution is to cite the blurb that I was really happy to write for the back of Sango's book. Quote, Unsettled Frontiers presents nuanced ethnographic insights and advances an innovative conceptual framework that deepens our understandings of the everyday realities and broader drivers of market formation in Southeast Asia's frontiers. An insightful, timely book that is extremely relevant to contemporary development debates, end quote. So building on that blurb and knowing that the other speakers are focusing on different conceptual angles in the book, I thought I'd focus and celebrate, first, the significance of Sango managing to successfully access these borderland spaces to begin with. Second, her important methodological approach, combining historical materials and contemporary fieldwork. And third, just a few of the important findings that I appreciated amongst many. And then I'll finish with a possible discussion question, which we were asked to do. So turning first to Sango's methodological approach. And to preface this, my own fieldwork is mostly located in upland northern Vietnam and southern Yunnan in China, with ethnic minority Hmong and Yao or Mien communities. So this means that one aspect of Sango's discussion in her book that really resonated with me are the difficulties of doing this kind of fieldwork, especially in the Vietnamese borderlands. Working in highly sensitive regions of the socialist state brings with it a whole host of complications, frustrations, and setbacks beyond the red soil that even colleagues that are doing fieldwork in Hanoi or in lowland rural communities are often pretty surprised to learn about. As Sango notes in her preface, working in Vietnam's borderlands requires depending on long-standing networks to gain those red stamps that are so important in studying such a sensitive region. Not only did she need to rely on her host institutions to facilitate the relevant national and provincial level permissions for fieldwork, which is pretty standard in Cambodia and Vietnam, but a borderland study requires a whole host of other specific permissions, including from military officials. So Sango notes, and I quote, "We returned to the provincial capital, taking another week to organize the missing documentation before we could return to our field site. A further complicating factor with Vietnamese approval processes was the need for documents to mention all the localities where the researcher would go, down to the commune level. Yet the networks that I was studying traversed localities in a very fluid way. I quickly learned to routinely include most border communes and districts in my targeted provinces in these approval applications so that I could flexibly follow traders and other network actors," end quote. So I've dealt with very similar setbacks as have my graduate students, and honestly, they wear you down. To persevere and to gain the detailed fieldwork data that Sango collected and reports upon so carefully here is a testament to her dedication and commitment to the individuals and communities she is working with and whose stories she is helping to tell. Sango also reflects carefully on the important role that our positionality plays in reaching our informants and having them trust us. She notes, and I quote, "I was able to broach quite sensitive matters during many of our interviews. I attribute this to the warmth and communication skills of my research assistants and the possibility that a middle-aged woman of South Asian heritage may have seemed quite innocuous to participants," end quote. Now, I think obviously the warmth and communication skills of Sango had a lot to do with this. And although me being white obviously adds a different positionality angle, I similarly find that being a woman makes me feel harmless for many participants whilst doing fieldwork. Yet I've also found that it can create barriers, especially amongst Vietnamese officials who are men, who do not necessarily want to take a foreign woman seriously. They certainly don't want to lose face to one, an important element in the Vietnamese lowland majority culture to which many state officials belong. Hence, if I present them with all the correct permits after they've tried to bribe some cash out of me, things can get a tad awkward. So Sango, I'm kind of curious if you've also found that gender dynamics can often be fluid and hence quite difficult to navigate in the field at times. But beyond reflecting on her own positionality, I also really appreciate the space and recognition that Sango gives to her research assistants. She explains how some of her assistants were able to complete fieldwork that she as a foreigner couldn't do, again, due to the sensitive nature of the borderlands. Networks. She also notes how markets are in this continuous state of flux without a clear beginning or end. So she thus challenges us to think of markets and market governance as constantly in formation through both the everyday practices that bind social and material worlds, but also how these are rooted in broader political and economic institutions. It's in all these ways and more that Sango's book is a significant contribution to border and frontier literatures, market integration studies, and livelihood debates in Southeast Asia. So, my question for discussion, and this is not necessarily a question specifically for Sango, it's more something that I keep reflecting upon and would like to hear others' opinions. There's a lot of important debate these days about the need to decolonize the research that scholars based in the so-called global north undertake in the global south. While I fully agree with this, I also work with communities where members often tell me, and I quote, "Please can you tell our stories? People will listen to you, they won't listen to us," end quote. I get the feeling from Sango's book that it might be fairly similar where she works, especially when she's working with Xiang, Wunong, and other ethnic minority communities. So in such humbling, yet also rather distressing situations, I keep wondering, how are we to do more meaningful decolonizing work? Is advocacy enough, or should we be doing more? And what could that look like, given the constraints one must negotiate in socialist spaces? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for raising that really important question, which we'll come to at the end. I think we could focus on that as a starting question. I'd like to now call on John-Christophe Diepart to share his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sango, for inviting me. And before making some comments, let me give some words of appreciation. I think I told you already, but I think it's a really fantastic book. It's really great. It's very well written, deeply original, and I think it makes a definitive contribution to borderland studies, but also agrarian studies in general for Cambodia, Vietnam definitively, but probably also for the wider Mekong region and beyond. And when I was reading the book, I had a feeling that it was also conceived as a rhizome. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that the book is messy, as in not organized, or the contrary, but you make so many connections between the chapters and between the issues that you address from chapter 1 to chapter 5 and the conclusion, that it feels really like, yeah, that we are really embarked in one story, and makes the reading very, very easy. So you for example, establish connection or interconnectedness between the past and the present in all the chapters, between the macro structural drivers for the change and the market formation in the borderland, and the micro and local contingency, and you constantly move from one to another. And you also navigate through the cultural, social, economic, and environmental dimensions of the change. So it's really, yeah, I think it's interdisciplinarity at its best. So well done, Sango, and very inspiring for people like me who struggle writing. So there are two comments I would like to make, which I think are very important. Many things to say, of course, but I will limit my comments to two points, which echoes also a little bit the research I'm doing here in Cambodia. The first is the quite extraordinary historical continuity that you describe in the book between, well, the French protectorate, but perhaps we could even trace this back before the French protectorate, but the continuities between the materiality and the actors that animates the borderland. And typically, the point you make on the rubber landscape and the rubber concession, I think it's a very, very important one. Rubber concession have been established, granted back in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and have been basically maintained all the way through up to present days, basically driven by the same economic logic of, capitalizing on large-scale investment and capturing the benefit of the global market. So I think this has been a constant in the history of the region, the agrarian history of the region. And one emblematic company, of course, of this concession landscape is Sokfin, that you make the very nice history in your book. Sokfin was created in 1909, I think, if I remember, from the Franco-Belgian group, Rivaux and Allais, has remained a lead company in the rubber sector up to the Second World War, and actually resurfaced in the 2000 in Cambodia. They were granted actually a concession in the Cochin-China region in the beginning of the 20th century, and now they are also operating concession in Cambodia. I think that's one aspect of the continuity. But what I found very interesting is actually what you document as the difficulty of the state to actually manage this concession. And I think that's a very important one, because the issues that you describe, like as happening 100 years ago, are still very much, for example, the fact that a lot of these concessions back then without proper, FPIC, as we call it now, free informed prior consent. And that created a lot of problems with the ethnic Bunong and encroachment of shifting cultivation. And this has created already back then a lot of protests and resistance by the Bunong, which is not unlike what we see nowadays, the different forms of protest that the Bunong are engaged in. And of course, including the trial in France, which is very topical these days. Another aspect of this is the fact that a lot already back then, 100 years ago, the concession were not efficiently used. So there were a lot of these lands basically not used, not implemented by the companies, which created also a lot of conflicts with the local communities. And this is a problem that the state currently are facing, and it's a huge problem in Cambodia. A third aspect of this continuity is the problem of price volatility, and the fact that when the price of rubber is low, it fuels basically the smuggling of rubber through the border. And these networks existed already a long time ago and are still very dominant and have a very central position in borderland. So I think these elements, and of course you talk more about continuities, there are other elements, but I think these elements actually invite us to really reconsider the way that we as researchers, but also the different development actors involved in managing commodities and borderlands should consider to really look at the past to better understand the present. The second point I wanted to make is perhaps a little bit more conceptual, and it deals with frontier dynamics and market formation. The classic approach, I think, to look at these market formation on frontier is to look at this with a core periphery approach, and we see basically the state and the actor co-opted by the state that move from the center of the country, the core area, and move to the periphery, colonizing the periphery, expanding markets, bringing the technology to the periphery. So the market formation basically result in this context as a movement outward, going from the core to the periphery. But I found that actually this movement as described is very, how can I say, it's very versatile and continuously changing. And there is very, very little stability, and stability is what the market needs to form. So we see the state of Cambodia, for example, issuing timber concession and then cancelling the timber concession, replacing them with economic land concession for agricultural development, and then providing title to fix the problems that the concession has created. After that, they promote contract farming to encourage, migrations, etc. So there is a very versatility, I would say. And my reading of your book, Sango, shows that the more stable elements actually needed for market formation, they're not situated, located at the core of this system, but rather at the periphery. And I'm referring mainly to this network of traders, middlemen that you described, that then basically populate your book from beginning to end. And I think these networks are basically the core element of your market formation. And I think this resonates also with the research I'm doing on rubber and in the northwest border here with Cambodia and Thailand. And I like to make two comments, two examples basically. In the rubber sector, there are a group of very influential people who are basically half Vietnamese, half Cambodian, whose position is very central. Of course, they are very responsive to global price, global market, so they're basically navigating in this, in global dynamics of the market. But they are basically controlling the market in Cambodia and Vietnam. And the way they do so, they, in conjunction with Vietnamese traders, they basically fix the price of coagulum, what you also mentioned in your book, the camblump, the price of camblump, so that the farmers are incentivized to coagulate the rubber, not sell the rubber as latex, but to coagulate the rubber, so that they can sell this coagulum to these middlemen and export informally without paying the export tax. And I think this direct intervention of the market, I think it's very important. And of course, as I said, they are navigating in the global dynamic of market, but these actors basically placed there at the border are really central in the way that market forms. And the second aspect deals with cassava, which is another crop that you look at in your book. Here again, the cassava, the way I observe it in Cambodia and here in Battambang in the northwest of Cambodia, the border with Thailand, is that the price are also depending on the global market, of course, that they are set at the warehouse level, basically along the border, and the price are set and then transmitted to the farmers. And the market is organized through, again, like in the case of rubber, through a very dense web and very organized, seemingly chaotic, but very organized web of traders who basically offer a very dynamic and very vibrant spot market. And in this context, actually, it's nearly impossible to make a contract farming work. So all the projects that you have described with the Ministry of Commerce, the UNDP project, who have tried to intervene on the market, and try to govern the market by pushing and promoting large-scale investment with these Chinese investors and promoting contract farming. I think these kind of projects, they are meant to fail right away because of this very dynamic, informal, semi-informal spot markets organized by these middlemen, who basically, the interesting point in this is the wedding across the border. The fact that people speak the two languages, Thai or Cambodia, Vietnamese and Khmer, and I think they are the key players. So the question, and I will finish with this, the question is more like, does it resonate to you? And maybe, and to you, Sarah, and your experience also in Vietnam, and also to Chanrith and the other colleagues who are there, and see what's, if that could be useful also to integrate in future borderland stories or studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean-Christophe, for those amazing reflections. And you have such detailed knowledge yourself, and it's really great to see how some of those ideas are resonating with your own work. I'd like to ask Chanrith now to say a few words. You'll need to unmute yourself, Chanrith. Thank you. We'll just try and keep it within 10 minutes so that Sarah has enough time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sango, for inviting me to join this book launch, book panel discussion. It's been a bit overwhelming for me to read your quite detailed and thorough book. I did my best to digest lots of discussions, empirical and theoretical discussions. But I'm not going to repeat what Sarah Turner and Jean-Christophe have mentioned regarding the points they made. I just like the others would like to sincerely congratulate you on this insightful book. I think on your hard work. I think it was I think really hard work for you. I think to accomplish this excellent book, and I really enjoy reading it and digested some new insights. Not only academically or theoretically, but I also try to understand your book with regards to policy implications. So as I'm from a Center for Policy Study, so I just would like to take on two short points discussed in your book, markets and migration, but basically from policy perspectives. So I'm not discussing the complex theories or conceptual insights that your book has provided. On markets, I think this is a very crucial insight that I have gained from your book, Sango. I think your emphasis on markets beyond the material exchange of goods and services for money in the analysis of market networks is extremely insightful. So I have learned a lot regarding this point. I really like the discussions on the role of social and political context, and especially the notion of social embeddedness in relation to power relations in markets. But particularly, I really like your discussion on the cultural values of land in commodity markets, rubber and cassava markets. So I read the conclusion, that I think you succinctly summarized the key points. And I do agree on the significance of the holistic view of markets when, we introduce, market-based approaches or interventions to improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, especially in Cambodia. But what I really want to stress here from your book is that intervention aimed at reducing small producers' poverty need to consider the political economy of markets. I think as Jean-Christophe mentioned already, power asymmetries among actors, elite capture, and market networks beyond the material frontiers. So I learned a lot regarding the notions and discussions of markets in your book. Your emphasis on the holistic view of markets is currently relevant in the Cambodian policy context right now. The government is drafting a law on contract farming with an intent to promote contract farming as an inclusive tool to help smallholders to secure competitive prices and markets, as well as the needed technical and policy support to make contract farming inclusive within agricultural development projects here in Cambodia. And within this policy push, farmers are encouraged to work collectively as agricultural cooperatives in order to engage in contract farming. And relatedly, a policy on public-private producer partnerships, the so-called 4P policy, is being encouraged, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries is considering to have this public-private producer partnership in order to implement the contract farming law. And it is expected that the contract farming law and the 4P policy will meaningfully engage farmers in various commodity markets. And that the markets they expect, as you wrote in your book, will trickle down economic benefits to enhance smallholders' income. So our center, the Center for Policy Studies is engaging with them, with the contract farming law, and we are helping them to develop a 4P policy, encouraging farmers to get organized as cooperatives to engage specifically in contract farming. So what I learned from the findings of your book is that you have provided complex notions and nuances of markets, the markets themselves, market networks, market formation, and the role of the state to influence market formation. But more importantly is how the state can rectify market failures that you discuss in your book, the various market failures that have, adverse impacts on smallholders' livelihoods. So I see your book has great policy implication within the current policy context in Cambodia. And what we have been discussing is that contract farming projects should go beyond an economic approach, should go beyond provision of technical and policy support to smallholders. It's been like the current thinking is to focus on the economic trickling down. That simply put, I think they believe if farmers get organized collectively as an agricultural cooperative, they have a better bargaining power in terms of market and price negotiations, in terms of increasing their economic voice. But what your book has demonstrated is that markets goes beyond economic commodities and networks. So we have learned a lot regarding these notions of markets and market networks. And quickly, my second point on migration is that the account of migration that you have provided is quite resonating, quite interesting to us, especially regarding the desire for land and sexual livelihoods of migrants in the northeast of Cambodia. We agree on this. As you know, we wrote a chapter with John-Christophe on internal migration in Cambodia, and it's quite resonating to us regarding this point. In your account, you also mentioned when migrants face livelihood stress, they would leave for new location to find land or work. So thus migration only could temporarily reduce land pressures in source locations. And you also describe how migrants grab indigenous people's lands or resources, forests, for example, and how migrants collude with local elite and powerful state actors to grab indigenous lands and resources, and also to intensify the land and crop markets by promoting land as a commodity, as an economic material, I may say, or material resource. So in this sense, I like the way that you discuss how the land commodification has eroded the cultural values of indigenous resources. I think this is quite important to note. So what I read from your discussion on migration is that migrants are an elite themselves, I think, in market formation, who collude with the state to manipulate markets at the expense of local communities, especially indigenous communities. So since your book discusses land governance issues in relation to migration, I really expected to read more about the role of the entanglements or complexities of migration in land policy and agricultural development strategy itself here in Cambodia, that the state could contemplate or could learn from the discussions. So I'm really thinking that if there's a further discussion on the nuances of the implication of resource frontiers in relation to migrations and land policy debates, I think it would really, really great. So yeah, these are just my two short comments from what I learned from your book, your excellent book. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Chanrith. And if there's time, maybe we can talk more about the policy implications of migration that you raised there, which it's true I haven't gone into in that much detail. So I'd like to invite Sarah now. Please feel free to remove your mask once you're at console, Sarah.
Thank you, Sango. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's super exciting for many reasons, as you've already heard from the panelists. But on a personal level, it was exciting for me to read your book because it took me back to some of our early visits to Milne in 2012 and 2013. I was having flashbacks to what was then an incredibly dynamic and almost frantic frontier experience. The mud, the timber traffickers, the chainsaws ringing off in the distance, the sort of constant advance of cassava and rubber plantations, migrants on the side of the road living in shacks, indigenous people torn apart by pressures and threats. It's all entirely real. So reflecting upon that, I have a few short things to say, and I'll mainly respond to chapter 4, which is called Frontier Rupture, a very compelling title. So the first thing I'd like to say about this is thank you, Sango, for being very brave. The complexity and the lightning pace of the changes that were unfolding in Milne are without doubt really formidable and quite confronting. Most researchers would probably run away, being utterly overwhelmed, or others might try to reduce the frontier phenomenon down to a few variables like commodity prices or population growth or area of land under cultivation. But Sango really deftly shows us that these reductionist approaches alone are not helpful and to solve problems and policies, as Chanrith was just saying. And certainly if we're going to try to regulate these unruly markets or mitigate against their worst social and environmental effects, we need to understand them far more deeply. So the book really persuasively shows us that we need to accept the unruly and networked character of frontier markets, while also accounting for the ways in which they are structured by existing power relations, elite interests, and by historical factors as well. So the notion of the unsettled frontier, which Sango describes as a rhizomic form, constantly reworking itself, is very powerful. And it reminded me of those early images of fractals when chaos theory came out that you would see on screensavers. It's patterned yet chaotic, and Sango somehow conveys to us how the frontier has a life of its own and the future is hard to predict. So thinking about rupture, I'd like to engage a little bit more with the idea of the exhausted frontier, which Sango talks about in the book, and she likens it to Marx's concept of metabolic rift, this notion that capitalism's processes of extraction must at some point reach an end, or a sort of final breaking point. And the case of Phum Pram Bai, Galsema speaks very much to this, and Sango writes about the timber extraction and the land commodification fueled by cassava and rubber markets. And 10 years ago when we were there, it was like a feeding frenzy. There was so much meat to be had and so many hungry people. But now we get the sense of the area being somewhat abandoned. There's this kind of post-boom bust setting in. And if you go with the analogy of the feeding frenzy, it's like an eaten out carcass. It's abandoned. There's no more meat left. So what begins to set in now? What happens? I think there are some really exciting questions that arise here. And Sango's book does really beautifully at kind of sort of prompting our curiosity about what might happen at an exhausted frontier. So if some people are going to ask, does this validate Jared Diamond's collapse theory, or is this, you know, the renewal of the limits to growth put forward by the Club of Rome? But I think Sango very deftly sort of manoeuvres around this and suggests that something else might be going on too. Something more like Donna Haraway's compost, something else is happening in the ruins. So with these possibilities of compost and renewal, I think they point to a theme that runs through the book, which I really loved, which is that of agency. We hear a lot about this and Sango deals with it so beautifully. So thinking about chapter 4, there is this example about what happens to those who are left behind at the exhausted frontier. The example of Pompeii, Busra, where the French rubber company, and this is the contemporary French rubber company, ploughed through the indigenous spirit forests and burial grounds without any prior consultation with the local community. And so we read about the now denuded landscapes that still seem to be inhabited by Bunong memories of the past and the ghosts of ancestors that were literally ploughed up from their graves. So the story is an utter tragedy, but the way in which Sango tells it honours the expressed anger and grief of the Bunong people in that place, and I think it's really important. So for example, going to Sarah Armage, who we've been reading a lot of lately, she tells us that the expression of sadness is an act of rebellion. Anger is a form of agency. So even after rupture, even after things have fallen apart, Sango's work is allowing us to see the agency in the lives of those who are left behind and in the lives of those who've suffered most at this frontier. So I guess for me, the book represents a really situated and affective account of what metabolic rift or what rupture is in practice. And I think everyone should be touched by these stories, and we should thank Sango for staying with the trouble, because there's a sort of bearing witness that's going on here, which is important. Okay, the final point, we're short on time, and I'll end with a question and a point, relates to the role of illicit extraction and illicit flows of commodities and money in this borderland area, which Jean-Christophe touched on. Illicit finance and illicit informal processes in Cambodia have this remarkable persistence, as many of you will know, and we do need to delve into the reasons why this is the case. So in the book, illicit economies like illegal logging in Mondulkiri appear in some ways as a response to desperate times, especially in the context of dispossession and poverty. There's this kind of frantic race to the bottom. But I think greed is here as well, and in part that is orchestrated and structured by the Cambodian state. So on the one hand, Sango is revealing to us a market that she calls, quote, ultimately ungovernable, unquote. On the other hand, I do feel like there are distinct patterns here, and Sango acknowledges this. So these are the patterns that suggest some kind of invisible hand, and it's not necessarily Adam Smith's invisible hand. It's the hand of the Cambodian regime, the ruling party, and the elites and the traders. And they have distinct logics and a distinct intent, which does shape what happens. So this example of the illicit rubber flows across the Cambodian border is a pertinent one. Our colleague Phuc To pointed out to me that in 2021, $1.4 billion of rubber crossed the border, undeclared on the Cambodian side. So no tax is paid. This is all informal. So some people might call this just bad policy on the Cambodian part, but I think we need to see a state that is actually creating the conditions for illicit and informal activities. And we must. And so on that note, I would ask you, is the market ungovernable, or is it in fact being governed in a particular other kind of way? It's governed by a state and its networks to allow illicit economies to thrive. So anyway, thank you for the most fantastic book, Sango. I know that it's going to generate many, many more rich conversations in the years to come. It's a really great contribution.
Thank you, Sarah. How should we do this now? Thank you. All right. Okay, we've got probably 5 minutes left for some kind of cross-panel discussion, which is what I'd hope for after everyone's contributions, and some really meaty questions that I don't think we can fully address in the time available. I think I might actually kick off with the one that Sarah Milne just raised about kind of what does ungovernable mean in the context of this kind of rhizomic market. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect on. And in the book, in other chapters, I talk about kind of how states have been involved in kind of the land commodification, state actors particularly, in the land commodification process, sort of the checkpost politics, and less so in terms of kind of the overall, governance of, not governance, I'll call it the driving of the timber extraction and so on. But I think overall, I would say when I talk about ungovernable, it's not that states are not driving or engineering things. I think it's about, at the moment, recognising that the way markets evolve overall, like there'll be particular interests and actors or coalitions of actors, but the overall market and how it works for different stakeholders beyond the state, I suppose, is not being considered. So in a way, I guess I'm sort of agreeing with what you've said, that there are interests at play, obviously, at all sorts of levels and amongst different sorts of actors, I would say. So yeah, but I'd welcome any other reflections from people on that question of the state role, perhaps from Chanrith or Jean-Christophe or even Sarah. Chanrith, I think you were referring to this somewhat in your comments earlier.
I think what I read from your book is that the state may not have capacity or a will to rectify market failures regarding commodity markets. Right now, what I'm saying is that here we have too many policies, and in each policy you find a common word, smallholder farmers. That's the center of each policy or strategy on agricultural development here. And in terms of policies, as I said, we have a lot, or maybe too many. And as I said, the contract farming law is coming, and the public-private producer partnership policy is also going to be developed. What I see here, as John-Christophe mentioned, the state here is not really like the state. It's quite informal and mixed up regarding the roles of the state and the role of the private sector. If you dive deep into the internal workings of the state or the state actors themselves, you see nuances and complexities of their mixed roles regarding how they should perform or function as a state, or whether they could function as the private sector. And then it's quite difficult to see because the water is not clear enough. So when a policy is implemented, it is selectively, enforced or implemented. As the case of the Bang Tunle Sap Lake recently, that land grabbing has occurred around the Tunle Sap Lake, and this been happening for many years already, and it was not a hidden secret that land grabbing occurred around the Tunle Sap Lake, and elites or authorities sold or rented lands to small producer farmers to grow rice or other crops. But then suddenly, the Prime Minister or an investigation into the land grabbing around the Tunle Sap Lake. So policies here, are decisions or options that we have too many. But what I see here is the will of the state rather than the capacity of the state to enforce policies and to implement policy selectively, in favor of their interests, especially their interests within the private sector that is not really private sometimes.
Thank you, Chanrith.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And it also reminded me that a point that I wanted to make in relation to what Sarah raised is, I think I've previously written about kind of how there are cracks within the state, and drawing on this idea of a rhizomic state as well. And I think it's important to recognise, I guess the idea of an invisible hand suggests a level of coordination that I don't think exists, even though it looks like it. Because when you break it down into the different agencies and actors on the ground, there's a lot of action for individual benefits going on, which may or may not contribute to a larger kind of ruling party interest at times. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind as well. Now, I'm conscious that we've reached time, so I'm going to just pause for a second and say, anyone who needs to, please, thank you for coming, and you're welcome to leave. But I'd just like to spend 5 more minutes talking about Sarah's important question on decolonization, and what can we do better in terms of, I wrote it down here somewhere, Sarah. Can we do our research better? How can we kind of provide more space and voice for some of the communities and issues that we're encountering in the field? And I found this quite a challenge, like the story that Sarah Milne was just talking about with the sock fin project and the conflict that's happened around there, and the destruction of kind of Penong lands, and also the intensity of feeling around that. There's a photo in the book which I had permission to use, which people wanted to be seen. It's a picture of exposed artifacts after the bulldozers had gone through this burial area. And it was very much kind of, you know, tell our story. We want this to sort of people to see what's going on here. And I haven't, you know, I have, I guess, in the field encountered also people from that community who were quite connected in with sort of different advocacy networks and finding ways to take action, like through the legal process that John-Christophe referred to before, and that we've kind of written a short piece on as well in the SOCFIN case. Yeah, I don't have any really neat answers, but I agree that it's a really important question to think about as researchers, and to actually look for spaces at a detailed level when we're in the field where we can elevate and provide opportunities. But I'm really interested in any quick thoughts, maybe from yourself, Sarah Milne, who also works quite a lot on sort of advocacy. Please feel free to chip in any final thoughts.
I mean, I was really opening it up for other ideas, but I mean, one of the things that always comes back to me is that maybe the advocacy we do to get these voices amplified in different ways, like you do so well with your story maps, for example, which are so great. Like, so having these stories more broadly available on the internet, I think, is a starting point. And I guess one of the ways I look at it also is about training. Like, I spend a lot of time with young students down in Hanoi, Vietnamese students who tend to be the Vietnamese majority ethnic group, and trying to work with them to perhaps dispel some of the stereotypes that they might have of ethnic minority communities, just because of very broad stereotypes that tend to be in society. So in some ways, it's not directly helping the people I'm working with, and I try to do that more like financially if I can, or through support, through working with small local social enterprises, but trying to take that step back as well and saying, okay, maybe we can do it at a different level through supporting training in different ways, and even qualitative training, which isn't necessarily supported that well in different places. But beyond that, yeah, like I think it's just a continuous struggle, and especially in a state environment that's so controlling as well in terms of what we can do as outsiders.
Thank you, Sarah. Did you want to add anything? Okay. Okay, agreement from Sarah Milne. All right, well, I think we're at the end of our time for today. I just want to again thank Chanrith, Sarah, Jean-Christophe, Sarah from my corridor, and all the participants for being here. It's been really great hearing people engage with the work. Chanrith, I feel like we have to have more conversations about how I can help you with some of your policy efforts, policy advice that you're trying to give. And yeah, I hope we can stay in contact, and yeah, that we continue to talk about some of the issues that we've covered today. Thank you all so much. It's been really great. Thank you.